Hi everybody, and thank you for joining me again on another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Amaran Spotlight SE. So what are these things? Well, they're high precision optical spotlight mounts designed to work with the Amaran 300C and the Amaran 150C. The point of difference between these and other spotlight mounts is there's no yoke or stirrup on the projection mount itself. It is literally just an optical barrel that attaches directly in to the Bowen mount. Okay, so let's start off with the usual disclaimers. Aputure or Amaran are not paying me for this review. However, I do get to keep the equipment that they've sent in for this episode. So technically that is payment because I am receiving goods, and that is why at the start of this episode there should have been a warning up from YouTube advising you that there is a paid promotion. So that is a legal requirement now with YouTube that I have to declare if I'm receiving any goods free of charge for an episode. All right, let's get into the review. So what is a projection mount? Well, in case you don't know what a projection mount is or a spotlight mount, it enables you fine optical control over the light coming out of the fixture. So for example here, I can light up just the box from a distance of 3 meters away. So that gives you some idea of what these spotlight mounts are capable of. Now that was done using the Amaran 150C here with the 19-degree spotlight. You can also do things like project patterns, which are called gobos. Okay, so let's cover off some important stats to start with. This is designed to work with a 300 watt max output light. So you don't want to put it on any light bigger than 300 watt. It's going to trap too much heat. Now these are optically designed to work with the Amaran 300C and the 150C. Is it going to work on another 300 watt light? Well, I don't know. Now, the fact that it's Bowen mount doesn't mean anything. That's just these connection points here. What can affect the optics on your light is the size of the COB area, or the size of the light illumination area can affect your optics. How far forward this is from the mount, as you can see here, this is quite a distance forward. Your light might be a different distance, and that could greatly affect the optics. So my best advice to you is assume it's not going to work with a light that it's not optically designed to work for, or it might not work perfectly. Okay, the next thing to point out with these is it uses a standard M size gobo. So that is a good thing. You're not limited to the brand specific gobos that are sold with this unit. You also have a massive range of thousands of these. So Roscoe are a manufacturer who sell M-size gobos or M-series gobos, for example. Now, quite possibly you might have, if you've been around for a while and you're an older gaffer, you might have some dado lights sitting around that have projector mounts. Those projector mounts use M-size or M-series. So you might already have some gobos that you can use. Okay, let's go through the pros and cons now, starting off with the cons to get those out of the way. And I only have 4 cons, which is not a lot for a projection mount. All right, so my first con is to do with the lenses. So let's assume that you don't know anything about projection mounts just for a second. These have interchangeable lenses. So we've got a 19-degree lens here, and we've got a 36-degree lens there. Now, if you want to focus or defocus your projection that you're doing, you move the lens forwards and backwards inside the mount. And then once you've got your adjustment done, theoretically you lock it here to set the focus. Now this is my first negative. On the side of the lens barrel, it has grooves where it locks. Now when you lock down into these grooves, it can result in the lens moving forwards or backwards, sometimes even as little as a millimeter. Because these are fine precision optics, that can change the focal point that you've just set. So that's a bit of a negative for me. The next thing I don't like about this locking mechanism is it can change the barrel's position a little bit from side to side. So as you lock it, it can angle. So that can affect the focus from one side to the other. All right, but most of the time we're not working in very sharp projections. It's usually a little bit soft. So chances are probably not going to notice it. The next thing I find irritating about these is the shape of the blades. So the blades here are like internal cutters. That's what gives you your cuts and controls. So on the back of the blades here, they're very thin. So I think what the idea was is that enables you to get some steeper angles. But here's the problem. If you're doing a very, very sharp or very fine cut, you don't have a lot of blanking or masking back here because the blade is so thin. The next thing that's a negative to me is you can't rotate the barrel. So you're very limited with your blade cuts, and with your gobos, you have to perfectly align them to what you want before you put them into the Spotlight mount. Now, the next possible negative is to do with brightness levels. It is not tremendously bright. Now, to give you some idea, because the stats might not mean anything, let's compare it to something else. So we've got the Amaran 300 here with the 19-degree lens, and let's have a look at the Nanlite Forza 60C with its 19-degree lens. Okay, so 300 watt versus 60 watt. Now, in terms of the CCT mode, or the white light mode, the Amaran 300C here is slightly brighter than the 60 watt Nanlite Forza here. Now, in the color modes, the Nanlite is actually brighter than the 300 watt here. So that's an unfortunate thing with projection mounts. There's usually a trade-off between quality optics and brightness. Okay, let's get into the pros now. So the big pro for the Nanlite here is brightness watt per lumen. The big negative for the Nanlite is it doesn't have a very even distribution of light across its beam, and more in particular, it doesn't have a very even distribution of color. Depending on the color that you dial in, it can actually be quite splotchy. Now, this is the polar opposite. It is not very bright watts to lumen compared to the Nanlite, but in terms of evenness of exposure and evenness of color distribution across the beam, these are vastly superior. So the two are complete polar opposites on their biggest negatives and their biggest pros. One big pro for the Spotlight SE is the quality of the glass. It is very true to the target values dialed into the light. So if you dialed in a target value on the light and then put the Spotlight mount on, you would be very hard pressed to see any difference at all unless you had a color spectrometer. There is a little bit of shift towards magenta, but it is well under the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. The dark areas on your cuts or in your gobo projections and any spill light coming off the lens does not have any color hue. One big pro for the Spotlight SE is it has a separate slot for the gobos and the iris, so you can use your blade cuts, gobos, and the iris in combination. The next big pro for me is the build quality. The barrel is all metal. There are also a couple of points on the body for safety wires. And here's a little detail that I like. Let's imagine somebody forgot to lock the lens in place. Well, it can't fall out of the barrel. You actually have to rotate it 90 degrees to get it in and out of its keyway. Another plus is if you go out and buy all of the optional extras, including a second lens, it all fits into the case. And the lenses are completely sealed, so no dust can get in. Okay, let's go through price and what you get for your money. So these are just some prices I found online today. $335 US and around 530 Australian dollars. Now for that money, it comes in this styrofoam case, which has a carry handle on the top, and on the front, you've got two latches which unlock. And inside, everything is precision molded. Now, the weak point, I reckon, is going to be the hinge here. I reckon that's going to eventually break, but it will definitely outlast the zips that were on a lot of the Aputure bags in the last couple of years. That's my personal take on it. I think this will last quite a bit of time, and you could probably put some gaffer tape in here or something like that further down the track. But for the price, getting a case anyway is a bit of a bonus. All right, let's have a look through what's in the kit. So the first thing I'll pull out is the gobo kit. It is sold with a 15-piece gobo kit. Now, I'm going to call it really a 13-piece gobo kit because you get an Aputure logo, which you're probably not going to use every day. And probably the least most useful gobo, in my opinion, is this little theatrical fire gobo. I don't think you're really going to use that. But the other 13 gobos are really well thought out. They are all patterns which could come in really handy when defocused. The next thing I'll pull out of the kit is the gobo holder. So this is for M series gobos. So you're not just limited to aperture selection. You can use a brand like Roscoe, for example, where you've got thousands to choose from. Now here's one little detail I like with the box. The gobos can fit into the gobo holder slot, but that is a much deeper slot. So if you do that by accident, you don't have to try and mess around to get the gobos out. Aputure have a little string here that you can pull, and it will lift the gobos out for you. Now the next thing in the kit is the spotlight mount and the lens that you selected. So you can choose either a 36 degree or a 19 degree lens when you make your initial purchase. Now I'm just going to take this out and show you something that's very clever with the design of the box. So in here, there's a space for your spare lens. Now the lenses are different sizes. So they've got this divider which can be moved from one side to the other. And this is permanently fixed in the box so it can't be lost. Now let's talk about optional extras. Additional lenses are $150 each, and there is a spot in the case for your additional lens. Now it doesn't matter which lens barrel and lens combination you bought initially, you can fit either lens into the kit regardless of whether one's your spare or whether one is in the lens mount because of this bit that moves around. So just to show you what I mean, I'm going to swap the lenses around. So I'm going to put the 36 degree lens into the lens barrel. Now the full slot here is made for the lens barrel with the 19 degree lens. Now if I switch this divider over to here, this is now the size of the lens barrel with the 36 degree lens. And now my 19 degree lens fits into that slot. Now the last optional extra is an iris. Now in terms of a negative with the iris, with a lot of other brands' irises, you can select the diameter that you want and then twist the rod here and it locks the iris in place. Well, that doesn't happen with this one. Now, one thing that is good is there is a space in the kit that is molded to put the iris in and keep the iris protected. Now, you also have another cavity here that can be for things like cleaning cloths for your lenses or additional gobos if you buy them. All right, so let's get into the testing. Now, before we get into the testing, I just want to point out that I've tested both the 150C and the 300C with both lenses. You can skip to the chapter that suits you. So if you only want to buy one of the lenses and one of the lights, you can just skip to the testing for that. Now I just want to point out that during the testing, I sometimes deliberately expose into the shadow areas. This is so you can see any problems or lack of problems in the shadows. But if exposed correctly, you probably wouldn't see any detail in these areas. Let's start off by having a look at the Amaran 150C with the 19 degree lens. Now, regardless of the CCT or color dialed in, you get a very even distribution of light and color. The blade cuts are nice and sharp, but there is a little bit of concaving. And it is quite difficult with the shape of these blades to get a very thin cut. Now let's try cutting on an angle, and this is a little bit tricky as well. This is about as thin a cut as you can get. There is a massive range of focus and defocus without any light emitters coming into play. And the optics are the same regardless of the CCT or color dialed in. Now let's take a look at a largely linear gobo. There is a little bit of concaving, but unless you're looking for it, I don't think you're going to notice it. And there is a huge range of focus and defocusing. the results seem to be the same regardless of the CCT dialed in. And the results are the same regardless of the colour. And even colour out of focus, there's no optical issues. Let's take a closer look, and the projection is quite clean. You have to get very close to see any chromatic aberration at all. Now let's take a look at some circular patterns. And there's definitely no gremlins in the optics. Now let's take a look with the optional iris. As you can see, the focus is not the same throughout the entire range of the iris. Now this is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo projections. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Of course, they're all on different planes, but they are close enough that you can have some creative capability with all three. Now let's take a look at the 150C with the 36-degree lens. And regardless of the CCT or colour dialed in, you get a very even distribution of both light and colour. Blade cuts are nice and sharp, but there is a little bit of limitation with the blade shape in terms of getting a very narrow cut. And note here, there's pretty minimal concaving or convexing. Now here I'm lining up the blades to the supports on my garage door to give you an idea of control and how minimal convexing and concaving is. Because the barrel doesn't rotate, angled cuts are quite difficult. This is the best you're going to get. And there is an absolutely massive range of focus and defocus on your cuts. The optics are the same regardless of colour. And you don't get any chromatic aberration, even if you're defocusing colours. Linear gobo projections are surprisingly sharp from edge to edge, regardless of colour or CCT. And again, you've got a massive focus range without any colour emitters coming into play. Upon close inspection, this is surprisingly sharp from edge to edge. And you don't see any chromatic aberration until you get extremely close. Circular patterns are very impressive. Everything maintains the correct shape, but you can't get a perfectly even focus across the beam. And there are no emitters coming into play or chromatic aberration when you focus and defocus projections. The results are also the same regardless of the color dialed in. Now I'm deliberately using this pattern because it clearly shows up the focus differences. Now let's take a look at the iris, which is an optional extra. Now let's take a look at the focal planes. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobos. And this is the focal plane for the blades. As you can see, there is some compromise, but all three can work together. Now let's take a look at the 19-degree lens on the 300C. And regardless of CCT or hue dialed in, you get an even distribution of light and colour. Blade cuts are extremely sharp, but there is a little bit of concaving. This is more noticeable on wide cuts than it is on thin cuts. Because the barrel doesn't rotate, this is as big an angle as you can get out of a blade cut. Once again, there is a huge amount of focus range without any chromatic aberration or colour emitters becoming an issue. This is the same regardless of colour dialed in. With linear gobo projections, it is not possible to get an even focus across the entire projection, and there is a little bit of concaving. As a positive, there is a massive amount of defocusing range. And the results seem to be the same regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. Upon close inspection, chromatic aberration isn't really all that noticeable. But upon really close inspection, you can see that it's there. With circular projections, all of the circles are round, regardless of where they are in the beam, but the focus is not consistent from edge to edge. And just like with linear patterns, you've got a massive amount of focus and defocus without the colour emitters or chromatic aberration becoming an issue. And the results are the same regardless of the colour. Now let's have a look at how the iris performs, which is an optional extra. Now let's take a look at the focal planes. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blade cuts. Now let's take a look at the 300C with the 36-degree lens. And just like with the other combinations, you get a very even distribution of light and colour. Blade cuts are nice and sharp, with minimal concaving or convexing. And once again, you have a massive range to defocus. With linear gobo projections, you can't get an even focus across the entire gobo. But in my opinion, it is way more than acceptable. And the results seem to be extremely consistent regardless of CCT or colour. Chromatic aberration is not noticeable until you get extremely close to the projection. With circular projections, if you're trying to get everything sharp, the centre will be in focus and the edges won't be, or vice versa. And if you're looking to throw a circular projection out of focus, there's nothing to worry about in terms of emitters coming into focus or chromatic aberration. When using the optional iris, the focus is not consistent across the entire range. Now let's have a look at the focal planes. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobos. And this is the focal plane for the blades. There is enough room here for creative use of all three. Okay, that's another gear review done, and just my closing thoughts. These systems are a no for me, and it's nothing to do with the optics. It's to do with the light head. It doesn't have any CRMX or DMX connection, and that really doesn't work with my workflow. But other than that, I'm extremely impressed with the quality of the optics and what you can get for your money in a system like this. It just blows me away compared to what something like this would have cost 5 or 10 years back.